All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to come here and talk North Korea. As a reminder, welcome to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, just in case you forgot. We're a membership organization, so if you see a kindly staff member walking around and want to pursue a membership, please follow up with them. As a reminder, we are on the record tonight. We're tweeting, we're live streaming, Facebook, Instagram. Feel free to use any of them and report it widely. Also, you'll notice on the monitors to the side, the screens, we are accepting questions online. If you go to chi.cnf.io, you can register questions there. They'll show up on the iPad, and we can incorporate them into the conversation. We're also going to be running a couple polls through that, so if you see them pop up, feel free to vote. Attitudes on North Korea, what the U.S. should be, how they should be engaging, and we'll try to pull up some of those results throughout the evening. One final disclaimer is that the opinions that you're going to hear here are the opinions of the speakers and not necessarily that of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Now, a second disclaimer. I generally try not to open up my panels with a second disclaimer, but that is the fact that we are on the brink of what? And we're looking at North Korea here. And the question then becomes, on the brink of what? Are we on the brink of regime collapse? Are we on the brink of a nuclear test, an ICBM, or perhaps opening and reform? And I think we've kind of intentionally left this question open because, frankly, no one quite knows what is going to happen next in North Korea. I was once told that anyone who will tell you that they know what's happening in North Korea is either lying to you or lying to themselves. So with that in mind, we're going to start to get into this. I'll have to ask for some sympathy as your moderator. One of the things that happens, we have quite a large panel and a condensed amount of time. One of the things that ends up happening when you talk North Korea is that all the issues get tangled together. We have nuclear weapons, we have missile tests, we have human rights issues, sanctions, diplomacy, and then we have some of the topics du jour. So for example, maybe you've all heard that Dennis Rodman is now in North Korea. Sure, he's going to be solving the North Korea problem shortly, if we can't solve it first in the 75 minutes here. I'm not making any promises. You'll probably be disappointed, so if you have a mass exodus now, no one will be offended. But what I can promise is that over the next 75 minutes, you're going to hear a very interesting discussion from some of the most qualified people to discuss North Korea. People who spend a lot of time working with the North Koreans or sitting across the table. I shouldn't say working with. That's a little bit dangerous. But negotiating with the North Koreans and dealing with them in a professional and a personal capacity. And then we have the more serious issues. While Rodman is somewhat of a distraction, we have the more serious issues of someone like Otto Warmbier, who was just released, a prisoner that was held in North Korea, an American. And on top of not only being a prisoner for fully a year, he's in a coma. This is a new turn, and we're not quite clear how the United States is going to react or how anyone's going to react, so I think we're all kind of waiting for that. Now, the sympathy part for the moderator comes here. We've just laid out a bunch of issues, and everyone has, in the opening kind of remarks, 3 minutes to lay out some of those things. As a reminder to our panelists, I'm firm, but I'm fair, so I'll try to keep you in line there. But when we talk about all these issues, I want to come away with two goals for everyone in the audience, including myself, is that number one, because of the range of expertise and the type of expertise, I want everyone to come away with a better understanding of the North Koreans. That's not necessarily to say the North Korea state at large, but oftentimes when we talk about North Korea, we think of it as just this kind of fully formed monolith, and we don't really think about how the people are living under that regime. And so we have some people who are particularly qualified to address that. Better understanding of the North Koreans and how they function with that and how they view the state. The second one is I hope we come away with a better understanding of South Korea policy. We don't really have anyone on stage who can speak onto the specifics of US policy, but we do have several people up here who can do a very good job of elucidating the South Korean policy, where it is now, where they would like it to be, and perhaps where it is going to go into the future. Now, for our panelists, sitting at the end, we have Gong No-myung. He is a chairman of the East Asia Foundation, and he is a former foreign minister of the Republic of Korea. Next up, to his right, we have Lee Chung-myeon. He is the Deputy Director General of North American Affairs Bureau at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in South Korea. Next up, we have Jean Lee. She's a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars, and she is the former Pyongyang bureau chief of the Associated Press. Spent 3 years, I believe, living in Pyongyang. And finally, we have Professor Moon Chang-in. He's a professor at Yonsei University and a special advisor to the President Moon Jae-in, President of South Korea. All right, so with that, we're going to go basically, we're going to hop around a little bit, but we're going to start with Minister Gong. Now, Minister Gong, I know you have remarks, but perhaps you can frame them around some of the longer-term thinking about North Korea. You've dealt with them in the 90s and probably after that in your personal and professional capacity. So how have you seen their intentions change, and has their strategy shifted in terms of nuclear weapons?
How many minutes?
You have 3 minutes. 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
Maybe 4 if you're lucky.
It's a very long time. Well, the past 2 decades of negotiation with North Korea has been repeating vicious cycles of provocation by North, then settlement, then the collapse of settlement. In fact, in 1991, the two Koreas had negotiations for denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. And we arrived at the joint declaration for denuclearization of the Korean peninsula by 2 parts of Korea. And in this declaration, we agreed that neither Koreas will test, nor manufacture, produce, receive, possesses, store, deploy, nor use nuclear weapons. Following year, we had rather intensive negotiation for implementation of this joint declaration. However, when we came to the discussion of special inspection to verify the status of the nuclear programs of both sides, the North made various excuses and finally boycotted the negotiations. And in the end, North Korea announced the withdrawal from the Non-Proliferation Treaty on March 1993. And the joint declaration between the two Koreas became a dead document. Next came the Geneva Agreed Framework, which was reached between North Korea and United States. We in the South expected that the Geneva Agreed Framework would provide a special inspection to discern the exact status of North Korea's nuclear development before it is formally concluded. However, the expectation met the same ending as the joint declaration. Former Secretary of Defense Perry admitted in his book, Preventive Defense, that the agreed framework was hurriedly agreed upon in the fear that North Korea nuclear material will be increased if the negotiation prolonged. It was agreed in the Geneva Agreement that North Korea will be provided with a safer light water reactor instead of a graphite reactor which they possess. The Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization was founded and constructed. Construction of the reactor began. South Korea, which had agreed to pay around $3 billion as a major player, used half of the budget when the deal bungled. When it was found that North Korea was still gaining nuclear materials through uranium processing rather than plutonium, in 2002. The Geneva Agreement also collapsed. Admitting that they had been developing nuclear programs since 2002, North Korea declared its status as a nuclear state.
Minister, you only have about 1 minute.
And furthermore, North Korea, in their constitution and the Charter of the Workers' Party, they clearly stated they are nuclear state. In January 2005, North Korea finally executed first nuclear test, proving that they are really possessing nuclear capability. They have carried out 4 months since then, speculations predicting the imminent 6 nuclear tests will be forthcoming. And an even graver problem is that North Korea is continuing its missile tests for delivering nuclear weapons despite strong objections and sanctions from the international community. While Kim Jong-il, father of the present leader, launched 16 missiles for the 17 years and 5 months of his rule, the young Kim Jong-un has launched 53 missiles within the 5 years of his rule. This year alone, the number has already reached 10. And since President Moon was inaugurated on May 10th, there have been 5 tests. The Nodong Sinmun, which is the official mouthpiece of the Workers' Party, ran an article 2 weeks ago, May 29th, that Iraq and Libya had met their doom because they had no missiles to attack the US. It said if there is no ICBM, it is difficult to maintain the regime. North Korean media are reporting as if such ICBM tests are forthcoming.
Let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and jump over to Professor Moon from here. So we've just heard kind of a long layout of the history of the negotiations, how certain negotiations have failed, and now we've seen a speeding up of certainly the missile program. Professor Moon, in your advisory role to the president, how are you advising President Moon and how he should move forward? And for you, what do you think South Korea policy towards North Korea should look like?
President Moon made it very clear that he wanted to have, he wanted to create a peaceful Korea. And how can he achieve it? And he has set up principles. First principle is that he won't tolerate any kinds of military provocation by North Korea. That's his first principle. But second, he also made it very clear that he doesn't have any intention to achieve unification through absorption, like the German type of unification. Therefore, he wanted to create economic community between North and South, have some kind of functional exchange and cooperation with North Korea. In that way, he wanted to have some kinds of consensual unification between North and South Korea. And third principle is this: he emphasized the importance of exchange and cooperation, confidence building between North and South Korea. At the same time, he wanted to really pursue peaceful coexistence with North Korea. And as a result, he hoped that he can have a de facto, if not the de jure, unification. That means was simply routinizing summit talk between North and South Korea, ministerial talk between North and South Korea, and parliamentary talk between North and South Korea. But going back to the whole issue of North Korean nuclear issue, he strongly condemned the North Korean nuclear and missile provocation, and also he is more than willing to comply with the international sanction regime on North Korea. However, he emphasized the importance of dialogue and negotiation with North Korea, and he wanted to have some kind of leading role in resuscitating the dialogue with North Korea. It won't be easy because now he's facing many problems. North Korea has become extremely hostile on him, and Chinese has been extremely critical of our decision to allow the deployment of American THAAD, terminal high altitude area defense system by the United States. And the United States is somewhat skeptical of South Korean move, of recent move to go through the internal, political and the legal procedures with regard to deployment of that system. Therefore, he's very much sandwiched from all the corner, from the US, China, and North Korea. Therefore, now he's working very hard, and I hope that he's visit to Washington next week. He'll be having a summit with President Trump, June 29th. Mm-hmm. And I hope that he and President Trump can come up with some kinds of magic solution to North Korean nuclear problem.
Well, magic solution, that's, you heard it here first. There will be a magic solution. Before we move on and talk a little more about policy, I want to turn to Ms. Lee. You spent 3 years living and working in North Korea, and you have probably a unique perspective on especially some of the issues we discussed at the outset, particularly on these prisoner issues. So I'd like you to cover kind of, put that in context for us a little bit. We tend to see that there are 3 other people that are still detained there. And how does that play for a domestic audience? And in terms of that, also their weapons program. How is that portrayed to a domestic audience? Are they looking for a high-level visit to get kind of a propaganda win that they can show the people that, see, all these people are coming to pay kind of tribute to Kim Jong-un? Can you help us out with that a little bit?
Sure. First, I want to thank you for turning your attention at the Chicago Council to North Korea. I can imagine that for all of you, it seems like such a faraway country. For those of us who are based in South Korea, it is terrifyingly close. But as a native Midwesterner, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, and I want to provide the perspective of an American who has, probably one of the few Americans who spent that much time in North Korea, so please certainly come back with questions later about what that's like. But I was in North Korea last month. I did make a trip, a week-long trip last month. And on the day that I left, another Korean American, a US citizen, was arrested. Thank God it wasn't me. Although I have to say, I can tell you that it is absolutely terrifying to be there. Anything that we do, to be honest, they've got a penal code. I've got a penal code this thick. They have a lot of rules in North Korea, and it is very easy to break them. So it is something that we are not so familiar. We're not familiar with what it's like to travel and work in a country with so many strict rules, and certainly without freedom of speech. And certainly that's something that Otto Warmbier unfortunately violated, and they had reason to arrest him. So now I think that one of the things about the arrest and the return of Otto Warmbier today, which is good news in terms of diplomacy, because every time you have American citizens in North Korea, it makes it very difficult to begin any kind of open discussion or negotiation between North Korea and the US. Now these are 2 countries without diplomatic relations. So they tend to have to use a back channel, what we call the New York channel. Just a reminder, the North Koreans actually have a mission to the United Nations that is based in New York. So we do have North Koreans here in the United States, technically on UN territory. So there is an opportunity to engage with them. But every time we have Americans in North Korea, it certainly poses a challenge for the US in trying to improve that relationship or have any kind of relationship. I think that, I'm sorry, you were asking again about the nuclear weapons.
Right, and how that's portrayed kind of to a domestic audience.
And I think that one of the things that we lack is understanding of how the North Koreans think. How does this play in Pyongyang? And that's certainly what I want to provide today. Now, I think it's really important. So for me, one of the things that I noticed on my trip last month, I was at their big sci-tech complex with a big building that they've built, millions of dollars, where they have all these high-level events. And one of the things I had to walk past every day, at least a dozen times, was a 1-to-8 replica of an ICBM that is designed to strike the United States. We cannot underestimate how important these nuclear weapons are. As Minister Gong mentioned, without these nuclear weapons, they would have absolutely nothing. This is an impoverished, small country with very little, and they take absolute pride in their nuclear weapons, and the fact that they can command world attention with these very expensive and dangerous toys. So it's very integral to their sense of security in the world. But there's a second reason why these nuclear weapons are so important. It is for Kim Jong-un, the current leader, to show his people that he can defend them. He is in his 30s. He's somebody that nobody had heard about until he was tapped in 2010 to become the heir apparent. So he didn't have a lot of time to prepare to become leader. It was only really 14 months or so after he was tapped that his father passed away, and he had to step into that role. So he needs something really powerful to show his people that he can defend them and that he can keep the country together and that he can do that for decades to come. He's a young man, and he's going to expect to maintain power for quite some time.
All right. Thank you. Now, turning to Mr. Lee, joining us with these, you're in the Bureau that handles North American affairs. We've heard a little bit from Professor Moon about where South Korean policy is, about how President Moon is going to go about dealing with North Korea. From your seat, when you're dealing with the United States, how does U.S. policy, or how does South Korean policy line up with U.S. policy? Are there gaps emerging, or is South Korea doing its best to try to bring these two into line?
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank you for hosting this important session, and I want to briefly highlight the common grounds which both governments have in terms of North Korea nuclear issue. Although some people are tempted to highlight differences rather than common ground. The most important thing in terms of common grounds between two governments is that they put high priority on the North Korean nuclear issue. This fact is very important, especially for the U.S. government, in terms of the interaction between China and the U.S., in terms of the international community's will to combat the will of North Korea to develop nuclear weapons. So in terms of priority, both governments put high priority on North Korean nuclear issue. And it is very important, especially for the US government. And second, in terms of goal, both governments have common understanding as the ultimate goal is the complete denuclearization of North Korea. So goal is the same. In terms of means to achieve that goal, we have many instruments or many devices in the toolbox. For example, pressure and engagement, dialogue. Although the military measure is not an option, we have many devices in the toolbox. And both governments have the common understanding that we have to make the best use of those instruments in the toolbox. So let me briefly touch on the instruments in the toolbox. We have, as I said, we have pressure, or in the more accurate terms, sanctions. We have also engagement, dialogue. At least both governments agree that the sanctions is not a goal in itself. Sanctions is for ultimate negotiation to achieve the complete denuclearization. So in that respect, both governments are on the same page. So that's a very important fact. And third, both governments have the sort of a similar understanding on China's law. You know, the trade with China accounts for 90% of North Korea's trade, and North Korea imports almost all of crude oil from China. So China is very important, although China does not want to be viewed as the most important stakeholder. So China is very important. In that respect, I mean, both governments had a common understanding that we should try very hard and very hard to make China tackle this issue in a very serious manner. So that's a old fact as well as a new fact to to recognize the China's role in a serious manner. So we have many common grounds than differences. Both governments have many common grounds in priority, in goal, and in devices or instrument, or in China's role. So we have many common grounds. And we have, I mean, as a special advisor to the president, Mr. Moon has already said, we have President Moon's visit at the end of June. So we expect during his visit, both governments will have a sort of a scheme of a joint approach to solve the North Korean nuclear issue. Although that is not a magic solution. Thank you.
Coming back to Professor Moon quickly. So a lot of talk of sanctions and kind of maximum pressure and engagement. So I guess a two-pronged question. Number one, are sanctions the right way forward? Maybe not necessarily as a step of South Korean policy, but if you are able to go into your personal opinion, are sanctions the right way forward? And on the second part, when we talk about denuclearization, should either the South Korea or the United States be willing to accept a freeze on the development of weapons as an intermediary step towards denuclearization?
This is my personal view, but sanctions, North Korea perceives sanctions as a hostile intention and act by the United States. Therefore, on the one hand, if you follow the crime and punishment approach, sanction could be quite logical response to the crime which North Korea committed. But the North Korea perceive what they're doing is self-defense act. And the American sanction is being seen as kind of, punishment of North Korea, which for the self-defense act of North Korea. Therefore, there is a very interesting perceptual incongruency between the United States and North Korea. Therefore, for me, I think the sanction has very limited effect on North Korea. Therefore, sanctions should be combined with engagement in a very positive manner. But for example, during the President Obama period, United States was pursuing strategic patience policy, which combined both sanctions on the one hand and engagement on the other hand. But sanctions and pressures outweigh engagement and dialogue and negotiation. Therefore, I hope that the current Trump administration and the South Korean government would give more emphasis on engagement side rather than sanction side.
Even if that engagement is through Dennis Rodman?
It doesn't matter. Whoever, really. And as to your second question, to be honest with you, as Jean pointed out, North Korea has about 20 nuclear warheads. It has nuclear facilities for the uranium enrichment. It has a nuclear facility for plutonium production. And also it has all kinds of means of missiles, short-range, Scud missile, intermediate range, Nodong and Mustan missile. Now it is North Korea at the final stage of developing ICBM. That's a fact and that's a reality. Then what is important right now is to freeze that kinds of activities and then move on to the stage of, verifiably dismantling nuclear facilities and nuclear materials. And then we can think about the complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantling of nuclear weapons at the final stage. Therefore, at the entrance, we should think about freezing North Korean nuclear and missile activities. And toward the end of this negotiation, or North Korean nuclear endgame, we can think about the verifiable, complete, verifiable, and irreversible, the dismantling of nuclear weapons. Therefore, we should think about in terms of step-by-step approach. And if you go back to February 13 agreement of 2007, in fact, the Sixth Party Talk was able to produce that kind of step-by-step approach. First stage was shutting down and selling, verifiably verified by the IAEA, and second stage was disabling of nuclear facilities. And at the second stage, everything was stopped. Therefore, we should learn from the past trial and error. Okay? Therefore, in other words, we got to be more realistic in dealing with North Korea. We got to be more flexible in dealing with North Korea.
Okay. I think the counterpoint to that is that a lot of people will say that we've tried that and then North Korea has broken the agreement, and so there's a hesitancy. The Six Party Talks where they've kind of sealed off their North Korea's they've sealed off their program and did that, and then later they've gone back to their old
I won't
habits.
get into that one. I don't want to debate it. But in dealing with North Korea, we got to really pay attention to several things. First, we should not underestimate North Korea. Second, we should not demonize North Korea too excessively. And third, we should think about North Korea from intersubjective point of view. We are always right, North Korea is always wrong. I do not agree with that one. Both sides are faulty. Therefore, it is very important because the Obama administration was infallible. South Korean government was infallible. Everything blamed on North Korea. In that way, we cannot solve the problem at all.
Can I just jump in for a second?
Yes, and then we'll come to Minister Gong.
Yeah.
He also had a two-finger.
Okay.
So Ms. Lee first, and then we'll come to you next.
I think that we often see North Korea characterized as this crazy country, but for somebody like me who spent so much time with North Koreans and in North Korea, there is a method to their madness. There is some logic in their heads to what they're doing, and there's a lot of repetition and pattern in the kind of provocations that we're seeing. We need to understand how they think a little bit better and what it is they're looking for in order to deal with them. It's like you need to know your enemy, and I think that we don't spend enough time doing that. But I want to make a point about the sanctions. I can tell you that there's a lot of sanctioned goods getting into North Korea, and I saw that firsthand. But I want to offer you another way to look at this. These are two different sides. These are two enemies of the Korean War. We have to remember that the Korean War never technically ended. They are in a state of truce. And these are two sides that are ramping up or gearing up to get to the negotiating table in a certain sense, right? North Korea is going to keep testing missiles. There's no way around that. They are probably going to conduct another nuclear test. And on the other side, the U.S. is going to keep ramping up the sanctions because they want to get to that negotiating table with the strongest possible hand. So I just want to offer you another way to look at this question of sanctions and nuclear missile buildup over the Korean Peninsula.
That tees up the obvious question of the chances for miscalculation on both sides. But before we get to that, Minister Gong, you had a two-finger on this
In
conversation.
fact, I came a long way to say a few words. Speaking of sanctions, we are now watching and witnessing some encouraging developments in respect to the sanctions. For a long time, we are very much desiring that China would be more serious in enforcing the sanctions which United Nations made. However, as you know, the Chinese regarded North Korea in a way, according to their own words, when the one loses your lips, the teeth get cold, which means the security of North Korea and existence of North Korea is largely interdependent between China and North Korea. Therefore, they were always rather lukewarm. But recently, particularly with the recent summit between the United States and China in April in Florida, President Trump requested China do more influence upon North Korea unless the United States would exert to the secondary boycotts by which many Chinese corporations, business firms will be involved. Therefore, now Chinese is making rather encouraging advancement in this respect. They are, as just mentioned, threatening North Korea. They will stop the flow of oil if North Korea embark on sixth nuclear test, nor ICBM test.
Not ICBM.
Not ICBM, exactly.
Nuclear
But
test.
nevertheless, I think they didn't specify it, but ICBM is rather very serious because the United States regarded it very serious issue. That is one thing. We are watching new development in this respect as well as sanctions is concerned. And the one point from Korean view, that is, US media are speculating a lot of these options which we can have on regard to the North Korean issue. That is including military, surgical strike. But to be honest, as a Korean citizen, I'm strongly opposed to any surgical strikes because which is not viable option. See, metropolitan Seoul, which is capital of South Korea. In metropolitan Seoul, there are more than 20 million people are living. And metropolitan Seoul is under the range of long artillery of North Korea and the rockets. So in fact, surgical strike, very desirous, to be honest. Nevertheless, which is unrealistic. We cannot endure such a big sacrifice once retaliation from North is executed. In this respect, Defense Secretary Mattis also admitted that surgical strike, military action is in fact not viable, realistic options. That is one thing. Another observation I would like to make is, as I just mentioned earlier, the North Korea regard to possess nuclear weapons and the delivery system such as ICBM, which can reach to the mainland of the United States, is absolutely necessary for them, for their own survival. So unless, until Kim Jong-un possess, or rather grab, nuclear warheads and the ICBM in his own hands, he will never stop, and he will never sit on conference table, negotiation table seriously. I think so. We have to maybe a lot of dialogue and negotiations are talked about. The final sort of destination of this sanction is negotiation table. Nevertheless, unless he has this ICBM and warheads, nuclear warheads, serious negotiation will never come. As I earlier said, that this North Korean nuclear issue has a vicious circle of provocation, settlement, then collapse of agreement. That will be repeated until the day, which I'm very fearful though, until the day the Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons, which can be delivered to the mainland of the United States.
Thank you for that. I want to pick up on one point you mentioned China. You seem to hint that they were being more helpful this year with the threats of kind of cutting off oil, but some of the analysis has come out has shown that, or suggested that China is talking a good game, but when their enforcement comes on the sanction side, they're not doing as much as they say they're doing, or as much as they should, according to the UN sanctions. So I want to turn to Mr. Lee. What is your position on this? Do you think China is enforcing the sanctions as much as it should be, and can it do more?
I have served in China 3 years ago. Until 3 years ago, I have served in China for 3.5 years, and so I don't have a vivid memory of China. I just recollect my memory about China, and together with my thoughts on China. China's role, at least in preventing or minimizing the aggravation of situation, China has been more helpful. But I think Korea and U.S. government should try more to make China tackle this issue in a more serious manner toward the change of situation. So my point is that to minimize aggravation, China was a little bit more helpful this year. But we tried more, and we try to develop more proactive means of making China do more in changing the current status in terms of North Korean nuclear development. So that's my answer.
Professor Moon?
The Chinese policy on the Korean Peninsula, very straightforward. First, peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. Second, denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Third, settlement of all pending issues through dialogue and negotiations. And they added up, President Xi Jinping suggested two more options. One is a suspension for suspension. That means what? North Korea freezing its nuclear activities and missile activities in return for the suspension of ROK US joint military exercise and training. Another one is so-called simultaneous pursuit of North Korea's denuclearization and peace regime negotiation on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, China has been very, very adherent to these basic principles. For example, I had a long talk with leading Chinese figures just last week. What they argue is this: we are criticizing Chinese, why you're not really joining the U.S. and South Korea in putting more sanctions in North Korea. But what they argue is that North Korea, there is some reason why North Korea undertaking missile testing, because Ronald Reagan, Korea battle groups there, okay? Carl Vince and the Nimitz are coming into the East Sea of the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, on the one hand, American strategic weapons are deployed in eastern part of South Korea. And North Korea has been responding to that deployment in methodical way by deploying all kinds of missile testings. Therefore, what Chinese were telling me was this: the U.S. and South Korea also should take its own share of reducing tension on the Korean Peninsula. Then China will have righteous way of really punishing North Korea. But Chinese are arguing that that was not the case. That is why expecting Chinese sanctions on North Korea, particularly suspension of crude oil to North Korea, may not be easy, unless Washington and Seoul and come up with some kinds of meaningful gesture toward North Korea in terms of reducing tension on the Korean Peninsula.
So while we're on the subject of China, I want to turn to Jean. What is the view of China within North Korea? We kind of get the official view. There's a lot of animosity we get from the government level towards China, the fact that they kind of have to depend on them in some ways. How about from the people you've dealt with or interviewed or talked to more broadly, government or not? The relationship between North Korea and China, is it as good as we are often led to believe, or is it much more?
Yeah, that's the thing. We were putting the presidency here is putting so much hope in China in being able to rein North Korea in, but really, does China have that much control over North Korea? Frankly, it's much more complicated and delicate relationship than we would assume. I think, as Minister Gong mentioned, China kind of treats North Korea as a buffer zone. We have to remember that, just give you a little bit of Korean history, but China poured troops into the Korean War because they did not want the US to be up on its border. We have to remember that. Perhaps if they hadn't done that, we wouldn't have this division of the peninsula right now. They have a vested interest in making sure that things kind of stay the way that they are. So they're kind of China's balancing this relationship with trying to manage its relationship with the US, also manage its relationship with North Korea. They also recognize that North Korea doesn't always listen. North Korea doesn't always listen to China. So they want to give them just enough to keep them afloat, and also just enough so that they have some access and some say. Now, there are two things I want to mention. On the ground, I think people, they resent the reliance on China. That said, they know how much they rely on China. So when I was there, one of the things when I asked people what they were concerned about when it came to sanctions was the fuel issue. And there were long lines outside gas stations. They were stocking up because they were anticipating with all this tension that China might impose some sort of blockade on fuel. And the fuel prices, they told me, had doubled. So very clear concern among the people, the elites of Pyongyang, that could have a huge impact on their daily lives. I was in some hospitals on this past trip. The entire hospital was Chinese made. So something like that, something as basic as healthcare, the people in the hospitals, the doctors, the nurses, they know how reliant they are on Chinese goods. So there are two different levels we're talking about. There's the official level, and then there's the level of the people who deal with this on a daily basis.
A reminder to everyone, we're accepting questions at chi.cnf.io, but we're also going to take questions from the audience. If I see hands, I'll acknowledge. If you want to submit them here, we'll acknowledge that as well. Yes, in the back, as a rule for the question asking, I ask you follow the basic 3 rules. Number 1, please identify yourself. Please be concise. And number 3 is most important. Please make sure it ends in a question mark.
What if China just offered the protection for North Korea with their weapon systems, and then North Korea got rid of theirs, and then the whole thing sort of ends, and everybody gets what they want?
Anyone have any thoughts on that?
In fact, we have discussed about that topics in Beijing. First, North Korea would never want the Chinese nuclear umbrella. Okay, we talked about the U.S. providing South Korea with a nuclear umbrella, and in return, China can provide North Korea with a nuclear umbrella. Chinese didn't want it, and North Koreans doesn't want it, and China doesn't want it. Therefore, that wouldn't work in that symmetric way.
Yes, over here, down in.
You know, in light of Trump's loose lips on many things. Oh, I'm sorry. Mark Fitzgerald. In light of Trump's loose lips on intelligence issues, and we saw briefly that the British intelligence declined to work with him, and he talked with President Duterte in the Philippines about where nuclear ships were in the South China Sea. Has there been any diminution of cooperation between the intelligence of South Korea and the intelligence community in the United States?
Very, very close, because South Korean intelligence agents was a creation of American CIA in 1961. Therefore, there have been very close consultation and intelligence exchange, not only between 2 intelligence agents, meaning CIA and NIS, National Intelligence Service, and also there is very close military intelligence cooperation. And therefore, with regard to the intelligence exchange between 2 countries, it's very solid and very robust.
And to add on to that, there's also an agreement in place called the GSOMIA. Right now, it's intelligence sharing between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. is the middle person, but the U.S. is involved in that way as well. So intelligence sharing is ongoing, and there hasn't really been, as far as I've seen, any suggestion that South Korea would start to withhold. Yes, over here, down in front.
My name is Jim Lottenbach, and I recently read that as China is, if you will, pulling back or having these discussions, that one of the things that may be happening is that Russia is starting to try and fill the void that may be left by China. Would you comment on that?
Anyone on Russia coming in to fill the void that China may be leaving?
I do. I do think that North Korea does play a game of divide and conquer. They do kind of play these different parties off one another. So they use access to Pyongyang as a kind of reward, and it may be this is an opportunity for Moscow to jump in and sort of exert its influence.
Yeah, as Jin pointed out, Pyongyang has been, kind of, wrenching between, Beijing and Moscow. Recently, Pyongyang ties with Moscow has been much more friendly, but still Pyongyang extremely distrust Moscow too. Therefore, now Pyongyang is in the situation of distrusting Beijing and Moscow. In other words, North Korea is inviting self-isolation by pursuing that kind of policy.
I'm going to take a question from the audience here on kind of the structure of North Korea. Does Kim Jong-un wield all the power in North Korea, or are there other players in the mix that help shape North Korean policy? I'll throw that open to anyone, Minister Gong or Ms. Lee, if you have comments on kind of the power structure and who the players are. And who, so example, if it's the Ministry of...
Maybe Jin should be able to answer that question.
Well, I think it's always dangerous. It's so hard for us on the outside, and even if you're in North Korea, it's very hard to tell what's going on to really understand how their structure works. But there's one thing we do know is that the entire identity of North Korea is based on this Kim family. So we don't quite know exactly how much power he wields, but the Kims, starting with Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea, his son Kim Jong-il, and now his son, Kim Jong-un, so much of their identity is based on the Kims as being the kind of legitimate rulers and holding the country together. So we do know whether it's as a figurehead or whether he wields that power that he plays a very important role.
In North Korea, the leader equals to the party, Korea Workers' Party. Party equals to the state, state equals to people. Now people equals to the military. All those 5 elements becomes one unity. But on the top of all these things is a leader, therefore Kim dynasty. But how therefore in that sense, Kim Jong-un of North Korea wield both formal and practical power and influence entire party and government and military organizations. He holds all titles. He's the supreme commander of the military. He is so-called the first secretary of the Korea Workers' Party. He's also chairman of the state council. Therefore, he literally has all the important posts. But one interesting observation I detected from North Korea is this: the young cadre, young people are gaining more power and influence. In all the figures, the symbolic figures, they are very much watched by the young people. Therefore, I think that the Kim Jong-un might have consolidated the new pattern of power coalition with the young folks, third generation of revolutionary leaders.
His
But I
power
think that,
base.
yeah. Therefore, he has a new coalition partner. Perhaps the reason why he purged his uncle, Chang Sung-taek, is because of eradicating vested interests of old generation and giving more power and influence to the young cadre.
And also in the transition from Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un, going from a military rule to a party rule, so making the party more powerful as the ruling sort of top agency rather than the military as it was under Kim Jong-il. This is too insider, though. I feel like we're getting it too much.
One of the issues that if you follow these things long enough, things tend to move in cycles. And one of the things we have not discussed here that is somewhat interesting is human rights. It hasn't really even been mentioned, and you'll notice that it hasn't really been mentioned, and if you follow the news, it hasn't been mentioned there either. It's been all about the weapons program, but for some time, it was all about human rights. So where has human rights gone in all of this, and why has it been seemingly put on the back burner now? Of course, the prison camps are still there. There are still executions ongoing, but it's no longer really openly discussed.
I haven't thought about that, but I think that, as you pointed out, these things are cyclical, but we've had we've had how many months now of this intense ramping up of missile activity and missile tests, so that has to be our focus, and that's a security issue. But I think the question of human rights, alleged human rights violations in North Korea will certainly come when things quiet down in terms of the nuclear activity. Perhaps we'll see that come up again as an issue, and perhaps in connection to the release of Otto Warmbier, the American student who was just released today. The questions of how he was treated. As you may know, he was released in a coma, so he apparently had been in a coma for more than a year. So there certainly will be questions about how he was treated and how American detainees are treated in North Korea.
But actually, there are 2 factors to take into account. The first is a priority issue. Now, North Korean nuclear and missile issue has become so intense issue. That is why we are paying more attention to human rights issues. And second is a really feasibility of really improving human rights in North Korea. Now, we have been really chanting about the human rights conditions in North Korea, but our chanting hasn't been really translated into actual improvement of human rights in North Korea. That is why there is a sense of some kind of a resignation and despair in dealing with North Korea.
We have a question right back here, man in the
From the things I've read, David Kahn.
microphone, please.
Oh, sorry. From the things I've read, I get the impression that the power of the North Korean leader comes from convincing the population that they're imperiled and in a constant state of war with the rest of the world. And if that impression I don't know if this is true, but the impression is created by some of these articles that if that state of war perception was weakened, then the leaders would be themselves imperiled. And if that's true, how could we ever have a bridge to this problem? These people seem to be, in a manufactured sense of paranoia. And I don't know if that's
Actually,
true, but
Kim Jong-un is kind of perfect Machiavellian. You go back to Prince. When Prince is in trouble, then he wages war. It's a very typical scapegoat theory. In other words, for domestic political purposes, he could create a perpetual state of insecurity, to guard his power.
I think that that's a very savvy military tactic that a lot of governments use. I would argue that a little bit of that might be happening here in terms of the war on terror. But it is effective. It brings people together, and that's exactly what Kim Jong-un is doing. He wants to sort of create a sense of unity by enforcing the idea that there's this outside threat. And I did write about this in the Wilson Quarterly, if you're curious to see some of the very visual examples of how they're doing it and how they're investing money in perpetuating this threat. But again, I remind you that they are in a state of war. So we have to remember that they are, the way that we behaved in America during World War II, just remember, this is not that different from the rhetoric that we saw coming from our own government during times of war. North Korea sees itself as being in the middle of a war, so they justify all of that and use it to their advantage.
Minister Gong, given that you've been dealing with North Korea for quite some time, was a deal possible before, say in the late 90s, and is a deal still possible now? That is, has North Korea gone through a rethink of the importance of its
북한하고
weapons?
협상했을 때 딜이 possible 하느냐? Is deal possible with North Korea?
Possible for what?
Deal, making a deal with North Korea.
And if not now,
Given
was it
your
possible?
experience.
You
Was
can
it
make a
possible?
deal anytime, but the problem is they don't honor the deal. No, that's true.
And this is the challenge.
Yeah, that's true. And why? I think they are very persistent. And the reason why they are so persistent and obstinate is that they would like to have a secure means to maintain and safeguard their regime. I think that's why they are devoting their efforts for the building up these nuclear capabilities.
They have different priorities and a different value
And
system.
also,
frankly.
by the way, let me add one more thing. They talk a lot about the peace treaty with the United States. But after all, the peace treaty is made on papers. And there is no guarantee on this paper whether that will be honored or that will be enforced. Because they are the one who always scrap the agreements. And how could they possibly believe in this peace treaty? Therefore, when six-party talks began back in 2003 onward, I thought that is maybe the way we can really see some structures for peace. Because after all, in six parties, there are two allies of North Korea. Now the problem is North Koreans do not trust these two allies. They don't trust Russians, they don't trust Chinese. The problem is really, we don't have a mutual trust between North and South. That is one of the problems. We have all these difficulties. And the same is applicable to United States and North Korea. So unless, that's the reason why I cannot help but fear, unless Kim Jong-un really has this means of nuclear capabilities, which he regards is a only safeguard for the maintenance of his regime, he wouldn't sit seriously on any negotiation tables.
Professor Moon, anything to add?
It all depends, North Koreans think that they have kept all the deals. Then North Korea blames South Korea and the United States. And we blame North Korea for all the failings, But I think still, deal is possible with North Korea. If we think that deal is not possible, then there is no raison d'etre for any dialogue and negotiation. For example, for denuclearization, a lot of people say now denuclearization is impossible. But for me, it is still possible. Okay? With that possibility, you got to deal with North Korea. But one most important point is this: unless there is a changing nature of the North Korean regime, we may not be able to achieve denuclearization. Therefore, what is important is the changing nature of North Korean society. Suppose you have, if North Korea has market system, civil society and the middle class. And that can lead to the major political changes in North Korea. But that can be, realized in very short time period. If we come up with a full engagement with North Korea and have North Korea adopt, opening and reform and adopt the market system. Because nowadays, North Koreans worship money, not the leader.
Yes, the young woman down in front.
The Associated Press has recently been criticized for a history of access journalism, primarily in World War II, becoming essentially a branch of propaganda. There have been a number of parallels made to current branches of the Associated Press, including North Korea. I'm curious how you would respond.
I haven't read anything recently. Is there something that I missed? Oh, I see. Okay, I'll take a look. Yeah, I'm very aware of that criticism, and I certainly endured quite a bit of it. I think that I had very clear red lines about what I considered the basic requirements of operating in North Korea, and one of them was no censorship. So they were never allowed to see what I was doing or read anything that I was doing before it hit the wire. And I said, you can Google it afterward, and trust me, they did. But I never let them see what I was doing beforehand. So in terms of, it's a really complicated question, and I think that it's a lot more, I think that you have to understand how difficult it is to operate there. So how the staff in North Korea gets their information, the North Korean staff has a certain objective. They do want to present North Korea's side of the story to the world, and they do want that to go through AP. What the AP does with that, and how they transmit that, and how they put that into context, and how they kind of provide the right background to make sure that it's not propaganda is up to the AP. So I'm not going to say there's any hard or fast rule or explanation here. I think it's very complicated. A lot of it has to do with the nature of the danger you're working in inside that country. And so I would just perhaps suggest keeping an open mind. But for me, I never let them see what I was doing beforehand. Of course, they knew everything I was doing because they kept very close surveillance on what I was doing, but I never allowed them to read what I was doing or see what we were putting out, and those are sort of my red lines. But if you have a specific question or something that they brought up, I do think that the history in Nazi Germany is fascinating. It was certainly fascinating for me to see, and I wish I had read a little bit more about that so that I went into this situation a little bit more armed and informed. But certainly for me, reporting from North Korea as an American journalist, my objective was not to put out propaganda, but to also try to understand how the North Koreans were thinking and provide their point of view, but with enough context so that we can understand or at least interpret where they're coming from.
Yes, down in front.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your life living in Pyongyang.
Okay.
I mean, probably most of us in this audience and those listening online have not had an opportunity to hear from someone who spent an extensive period of time, 3 years, living there. So what was your life like? What was your, what were the sort of, what was a day like? How did you do your work? Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Just very quickly, Pyongyang is not that far from Seoul, frankly. So I was running the AP office in Seoul, and I used to just wish that I could drive my car through the border and I'd be there in 3 hours. But because of the nature of the political situation, I had to fly to Beijing. As an American, I can't actually get I couldn't get a visa to live there. I had to get a visa every month. And then I would fly from, and frankly, your journey really starts when you go to the airport and start to check in. As an American, you are considered to be an enemy. There's no doubt about that. They make it very clear everywhere you go that you are the enemy. You see it everywhere, you hear it everywhere. And as a journalist, you're considered to be a spy. So it's not, I have to say, not the best circumstance, very difficult. And there's constant surveillance. So these make life incredibly difficult, needless to say. But I have to say that one of the values, and this maybe goes along with the question about having a bureau in North Korea, I was there for long stretches. So I was there for 3 to 5 weeks at a time, almost every month. So I lived there in the hotel under surveillance, but 3 to 5 weeks is a long time to maintain a charade. So I did get to know the people. I did get to speak to them on a daily basis and get to know what their dreams were, what their daily concerns were, how they got their food every day, what the power structure was like on a sort of ground up level. And that is invaluable toward understanding what daily life is like. My life was very difficult in the sense that, I'm not going to say it was more difficult than the North Koreans, because they have it. One thing I learned is that they have a very difficult life. No matter what you see in their propaganda, it is tough. This is a place where in the countryside, almost no electricity, no running water, no toilets, and even in Pyongyang, it was very rare at the time to have a building with running water, electricity. So very hard conditions, a country that's, the weather is probably colder than Chicago, so extremely cold conditions, very little heat. So every day is a struggle for the North Koreans. For me, it was tough because I did not have the freedom that we are accustomed to. I could not go freely for a walk. I could not make a phone call without being listened to. I could not just interview anyone that I wanted to. I had to go through jump through a lot of hoops to make sure that I was speaking to people candidly and getting candid interviews. I would love to go into more detail, but I think we're probably short on time, so hopefully I can share a bit more of that in another forum.
Before we fully wrap up, this gentleman in the blue blazer, yeah, he's been waiting a while.
Yeah, there's another player on the stage that's very interested in what's going on in North Korea, and that is Japan. And so I'd like to hear what you can tell us what's going on in Japan, public opinion, division among the governmental leadership and foreign policy people. What's Japan thinking about all this?
Japan, Prime Minister Abe loves North Korean issue because whole North Korean missile testing has become kind of political in a capital to Prime Minister Abe, and therefore it's a blessing for him. Therefore, on the one hand, it's a real threat to Japan. On the other hand, it is a kind of political blessing for him. And also, by taking advantage of North Korean threat, he has been trying to cultivate political ties with President Moon Jae-in, and at the same time try to enhance coordination and cooperation among Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. Therefore, North Korean provocative behavior has some kind of complicated implications for Japanese politics.
All right, in the remaining time, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative to ask the last question. And this question is going to go to all of the panelists, and I hope to get an answer. This comes from the audience, and I think it's really interesting. What are some positive aspects each of you try to keep in mind through these critical times with North Korea? Of course, there's a lot of talk about perhaps a preemptive strike from the U.S. The Trump administration has been somewhat hinting at that. There's a lot of tension, missile tests, perhaps a sixth nuclear test. What's one positive thing that you try to keep in mind through all of this? It's very easy to get caught up in the headlines and live in a lot of fear. South Korean public doesn't seem to agree. They live quite calmly. Well, how about for you personally? We'll just start over here and come down the line. Minister Gong, what do you keep in mind to stay positive? During this time, how do you stay positive about relations with North Korea?
Be a little bit louder.
Yeah, so how, during these tough times with North Korea, how do you stay positive? What is something positive that you think about?
Positive.
Somewhat unfair that he has to go first.
I cannot think of anything positive coming from North Korea.
Shall I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
One thing
We'll give you.
One thing I admire them, their persistence.
Okay, persistence.
From the Korean government's point of view, one thing which is very positive is that the U.S. government, as I said already, U.S. government puts a very high priority on the North Korean nuclear issue. And that fact impacts the attitude of China toward this issue. So I think that aspect that the U.S. government puts a high priority on this issue is a sort of driving force for a common approach between two governments and driving force for a more speedy solution of this issue. Thank you.
Ms. Lee?
So I would say one positive thing is that none of these parties want to have another Korean War, and we need to remember they don't want a conflict. So we have to try to keep that in mind and just figure out how to get to that point to resolve this. But I do want to also point out that we have to remember that there are real people at stake here on the Korean Peninsula, on both sides of the DMZ, including myself and all of us, but in North Korea as well, and that we need to separate the system from the people and remember that they are as complicated and as diverse as we all are, and not to sort of treat them as a caricature or treat North Korea as a joke, because if we treat it as a joke, this is a country with some serious weapons, with serious ramifications, and a whole population at stake.
Positive. I think the people in Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul are taking North Korean nuclear and missile threat very seriously. I think that's a positive development. And second, a lot of people talking about the regime collapse in North Korea or transformation of North Korea, and etc. But now they're talking about the importance of a transactional relationship with North Korea. That means what? Transactional as opposed to transformational means that Washington, Seoul are willing to talk with North Korea. And I think that is another positive aspect. And third one, in the past, all the options on the table, okay? But now they're talking about the more so-called flexible agenda setting. In the sense, the current crisis is leading to some kinds of new horizon for hope, hope, peaceful settlement of the Korean issue. And I would say that is a positive aspect.
With that, thank you to the Korean Consulate for helping us to set all of this up. Thank you to the East Asia Foundation for their support. And with that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.